I am on with Scott Graves from the California Budget and Policy Center. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on and talk about this very interesting topic, the Gann limit. And
Yeah.
let's start, if you could just give us an introduction, Scott.
Yeah. So I am Scott Graves. I'm the Director of Research at the California Budget and Policy Center. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Sacramento. We focus on state policies and policy solutions that could improve the lives of Californians with low and middle incomes.
Excellent. There's a lot of implication of the Gann limit for advocates who are proposing any kind of spending in addition to what the governor has proposed. And so there's a lot that we need to pay attention to and that advocates should be paying attention to. It's sort of this big hovering thing that you know it's there, but you're not entirely sure what that means. So I want to stay big picture so we don't get into the weeds, but ultimately, what is it that advocates should know moving forward as we get deep into budget season? Because we know subcommittees are hearing the governor's budget, stakeholders are putting their proposals forward, and we want them to be prepared for this conversation because it's inevitable it will come up when you talk to staff or legislators or the administration. So let's start with just a quick history of the Gann limit and what it does.
Right. That's a really important place to begin. Before sort of diving into those details, I think it's important for your audience to remember, as we always emphasize at the Budget and Policy Center, that budgets are about our values and our priorities as Californians. And when you start from that perspective, from the state budget reflecting our values, you realize very quickly that the Gann limit is holding us back.
Hmm.
So the origin story of the Gann limit really goes back to the anti-tax movement in California of the late 1970s. It was added to the state constitution through voter approval of Proposition 4 back in 1979. It's a spending cap that applies to both state and local government. In case people are wondering, why is it called the Gann limit? The Gann limit refers to one of the authors of the measure, Paul Gann, who was also one of the masterminds behind Proposition 13, the world famous property tax limitation measure Californians approved on the ballot back in 1978. Apparently, Paul Gann thought that wasn't enough. We needed to further constrain state and local governments. So they came back for another bite at the apple in 1979 with this spending cap measure that became known as Proposition 4 and was ultimately known as the Gann limit. For people trying to understand what the Gann limit is doing, the big picture way that I've been trying to explain it is that it is an effort by a prior generation of California, basically the small slice of the electorate who voted for the Gann limit back in 1979. It's an effort to impose their budget priorities on all future generations of Californians. If I could go a little deeper into the weeds, not too far, and I want to point out for your audience that the California Budget and Policy Center's website, calbudgetcenter.org, has some good Gann limit resources, including a Q&A that answers some basic questions. But if we're just stepping back and trying to briefly, at a high level, understand the mechanics of it, essentially what's happening is the Gann limit is drawing an arbitrary line. That's the spending cap. And looking at whether revenues, with some exclusions, and we're going to get to those later, are going over that line across a 2-year period. If the answer to that question is yes, revenues over a 2-year period go above the line, then the state constitution considers those to be excess revenues, and they are required to be split 50-50 between taxpayers on the one hand and schools and community colleges on the other hand. So the big question every year, and for the last year really, has been, is the state going to exceed the Gann limit? This year, the answer is clearly yes. We're going to learn more when the governor's May revision comes out in a few months. The question that logically follows from that is, well, if we are going to go over the Gann limit, what options does the legislature and does the governor have to address that?
Scott, really quickly, why this year and last year are we now dealing with the Gann limit and not before?
Without getting into the details, really what's going on, it's becoming an issue now, both because of the way the limit is calculated and revenues are taken into consideration, and also the fact that revenues are coming in beyond anyone's expectations. No one a couple years ago, as we were sliding into this pandemic and the economic fallout, anticipated that we would see the kind of revenue gains that we've seen over the last couple of years. Of course, main from those at the top, the wealthiest Californians, corporations, believe it or not, are continuing to do well despite the suffering of millions of Californians who have lost jobs and income has been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. The way the limit is calculated, the fact that revenues are coming in unbelievable ways that no one could have imagined, it's actually causing us now to not just be bumping up against the Gann limit for the first time in decades, but to be in a position where we are going beyond the limit, and we're going to have to decide what, as a state, are we going to do about that.
So can you clarify the Gann limit states that anything over this arbitrary line has to be returned back, but it goes two places, right? By the law?
Yeah, this is what I call the do nothing option. State leaders could just say, we'll just let revenues come in as they come in, and we'll look at how far above the arbitrary line, the Gann limit, they are, and we'll calculate our, quote, excess revenues. And once we know what they are, let's say it's $10 billion, just to have a number to work with, half of that will go back to taxpayers in some form, and the other half would go back to schools and community colleges on a per pupil basis. That assumes that policymakers think it's a good idea for excess revenues to be declared. They have other alternatives, though.
So what are the state's options for responding to Gann?
So one, as I just said, is do nothing, let the 50-50 split trigger, count the excess revenue, send half to taxpayers and the other half to schools. The other thing that policymakers can do, though, is to preemptively respond. They can take action using the limited flexibility that's provided by the Gann limit in order to avoid going over the limit. So there are some ways, they're very constrained, but there are some ways in which the Gann limit allows policymakers to make decisions that will prevent the state from going over the limit. The first thing they can do is to allocate more tax revenues to purposes that are excluded from the Gann limit. The reality of Gann is that it does not treat all spending equally. The Gann limit turns a blind eye to some categories of spending. So one of these areas, for example, is infrastructure. Under the Gann limit, spending on infrastructure, we can get into the details later, does not count toward the limit. It's sort of like off the books in the eyes of the Gann limit. It doesn't put the state over the limit. Another major category of spending here is emergency related spending. If spending is being used to help address an emergency declared by the governor, then that is also not counted toward the Gann limit. So there are some opportunities on the spending side. Also on the revenue.
Let's stop just a second then.
Yeah.
Can you dig into infrastructure and what exactly does that mean?
Sure. Okay, so infrastructure is actually, for the purpose of the Gann limit, is defined in state law as a fixed asset. Now that can be a building, it can be land, it can be construction. It has to have a useful life of at least 10 years, and it has to have a value of at least $100,000. It does not have to be state-owned, so it doesn't have to be a sort of state-owned property, right? It's really important to realize that under the state's definition, a lot of spending on housing can be counted as infrastructure that is exempt from the Gann limit. So that presents a really incredible opportunity for advocates to push state policymakers to spend more on housing-related infrastructure, both to address the state's tremendous needs in terms of homelessness and the lack of affordable housing, and also to address the Gann limit.
Scott, can you go deeper also into what qualifies as an emergency?
Sure. An emergency, first of all, it has to be declared by the governor. And secondly, any spending that's intended to address the emergency has to be passed by a 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature.
Okay.
So there is a supermajority vote requirement there. An emergency for the purpose of the Gann limit is defined in the state constitution and it means conditions of disaster or extreme peril, which is fairly broad. They do give some examples in there, but we know from the last 2 years that a deadly virus circulating through the population as a pandemic is also an emergency, and a governor declared a state of emergency
Right.
2 years ago that's still in effect. Advocates, if they can make a legitimate case, a reasonable case that their budget request is responding to the COVID-19 emergency that's in effect, then that could be a path forward on that budget ask. But the thing to keep in mind is that it has to pass the smell test, right? I mean, the arbiters of this are going to be the budget staff in the legislature and the governor's Department of Finance. Anybody can, of course, say that their budget ask is somehow related to addressing this emergency,
Right.
but you may be getting some quizzical looks or some critical questions coming back at you if it turns out that there's some skepticism,
Right.
it actually addresses the emergency. But
Well,
it still is important to realize
yeah.
that emergency spending does qualify. So, for example, if the state wanted to provide some relief to renters who are having such a hard time keeping a roof over their heads right now, they could provide some assistance to renters and declare that it is related to the COVID-19 emergency and the economic fallout. It seems to us that that would be a perfectly reasonable use of those dollars.
What about more regional states of emergencies relating to fires or floods or, I mean, unfortunately, states of emergency seem to be very common these days.
Yes, all the Constitution says is it's a state of emergency declared by the governor. I don't think that there's anything in there that specifies a statewide state of emergency. So
Okay.
I believe, but I'm not 100% sure that, regional states of emergency would also qualify in terms
Okay.
of spending going out the door to address those emergencies, and then also not counting against the Gann fund.
Well, that's good to know. I'll put a caveat to everything we're talking about. All of this is needing more discussion, right? In terms of our interpretation. There's what's written in law clearly. But as you said, the passing the smell test, using it for a specific example is something that each group needs to explore on their own and get more feedback there. What are examples of ways that they could reduce revenue as another option to respond to Gann?
Right. Really important question. So one of the things that we've been highlighting is the option of expanding tax credits. So for example, a lot of folks know that we have our own earned income tax credit in California. We also recently what's called the young child tax credit. So these are both opportunities to provide additional financial assistance to households with low income. They've been doing a lot of good in California, but of course, improvements are needed, expansions are needed. And expansion of this kind would help with the Gann limit because these are scored as revenue reductions, not as spending. To the extent that we expand one of these tax credits, we're not only helping California families and individuals, we're also helping the state to avoid going over the Gann limit because it means fewer dollars will be coming in to the state treasury, or at least scored that way. That makes it less likely that we would be going over the limit. It's sort of a revenue way of helping to address the Gann limit. The way we're hoping advocates will think about this is that there's an opportunity here to manage the Gann limit in a way that promotes equitable policy outcomes, right?
That's right.
Having the Gann limit doesn't make sense for California, it doesn't work for California, but the reality is in the short term, we have to live with it. So the question is, how do you live with the Gann limit in a way that does the most good for the Californians who clearly need the help today?
So the purpose of this conversation, as I said before, is for advocates to understand, especially those that are promoting budget requests, what they're up against, right? The state has this major issue with Gann and is incentivized to do one of these options in response. And so it would probably be a good thing to think about what you're trying to do in that lens, recognize, am I actually doing something that helps address the Gann limit? That's super, right? Because now you have a great selling point. But if I'm not, what does that mean for what I can do this year? Or how do I respond when the administration or budget staff say, no, that's not possible because of Gann?
That's a great summary. One thing that all advocates should keep in mind is that The Gann limit is a constraint, but it should not be used by budget staffers or anyone, even in the administration, as an all-purpose excuse for rejecting a budget request. We've actually been hearing some advocates talk about how they were told they couldn't do something this year because of, quote, the Gann limit, when in fact, the proposal that they were putting forward to us would fit within one of the exceptions we already talked about, maybe infrastructure, maybe legitimate emergency spending to respond to the pandemic. The first thing advocates should realize is they need to be smart about when they hear from someone in a position of power within the budget process that they, quote, can't do something because of the Gann limit. They should take that seriously, but they should also do their homework and make sure that in fact is accurate, because Gann limit presents serious obstacles. If an advocate has a budget request that does not clearly fit within one of the exemptions from the Gann limit, it's not infrastructure, it's not emergency related, it's not a tax credit, or it doesn't make sense as a tax credit, and it's going to be really hard that kind of idea forward this year. If you have an idea that could be considered infrastructure or be shifted to infrastructure or genuinely respond.
Right. Rethink what it is you're trying to do. Right. That's right. There's ways to respond to crisis within those umbrellas. Right. Got it.
So there are obstacles and there are opportunities.
I like that. Yes. Because if you are promoting things that help reduce revenue, that is a good thing. I would say, let's add it all on the menu. Let's look at all of these options.
Yeah. Let's not reduce taxes on the wealthiest in order to cut revenue.
Well, clearly, yeah. I think we share that opinion for sure. Okay, so let's go to the most recent report from the LAO. I don't want to get into the weeds. Instead, I do think the ramifications of this LAO report need to be understood again, because it significantly impacts what advocates are trying to do.
My big picture takeaway on it, reading between the lines, they didn't necessarily say this. But we have some major budget-related constitutional formulas in California that are working at cross purposes or simply are not working very well together or not in a way that most people would have ever expected. I'm talking about these major formulas. I mean, yes, the Gann limit, what we're talking about today, but I'm also talking about Proposition 98, which a lot of folks know is the annual funding guarantee for K-12 schools and community colleges. And I'm also talking about Proposition 2, which voters passed a few years ago and requires good chunks of money to be set aside every year for reserves and to pay down certain state debts. When you put all of those constitutional requirements together, layered on top of each other, in an environment where we are seeing incredible revenue gain, we continue to have what's called unanticipated revenues. What the LAO pointed out in their report, as an example, is that the way Gann, Prop 98, and Prop 2 are working together, for every dollar of discretionary, unanticipated revenue that is coming in, every dollar above the governor's projections, we are going to owe $1.60 in constitutional obligations. At least that is a reasonable scenario. Let me say that again. For every additional dollar coming into the state treasury beyond projections, we would owe $1.60 to the Gann limit, to Prop 98, and to Prop 2. We don't want to get into the weeds of all that, how all that is working. People are thinking, wait a minute, you take in $1, but you owe $1.60? Where does that money come from? Well, that money comes from other places in the budget. That means that it puts at risk a lot of the budget asks that are already on the table this year from advocates. And it also puts at risk the discretionary policy proposals that even the governor had in his own budget proposal from January.
That's a big deal.
The LAO actually did a very good job of describing this. It's a 10-page report. It's very well written. I would urge people to go and read this report.
Yeah. Have we heard any response from the administration or the legislature on this?
I have not heard any official responses.
Yeah.
I think the answer from the administration would be, you will hear our response when we release our May revision. There are budget staffers in the legislature in both houses who are very concerned about the Gann limit. They're trying to figure out the legislature's approach to this, what to do about it. We're all trying to figure out what it means without fully understanding what it's going to look like. We're simply going to have to wait until May and the release of the governor's revised budget for the harder numbers that we're going to need to assess, what does this all mean? What is the governor saying we should do? Now, what does the legislature think we should do? What's really bad about this situation, though, is that there are a lot of really great advocacy requests and ideas out there that probably just are not going to cut the mustard, right?
Yeah.
There are only so many ways you can claim that you're responding to an emergency. A lot of people aren't going to have infrastructure ideas. Tax credits aren't going to make a lot of sense in many places. So, we're talking about things like, boosting investments in childcare. We know that it's desperately needed.
Yeah.
We need more supports for seniors and people with disabilities. We need more ongoing housing assistance. That's all the kind of stuff where the Gann limit says, no, that's all excess. That's not really important.
It's not excess, right?
It's not other things.
That's responding to real life right now, right?
Yeah.
Right. So where should we direct advocates who want to learn more about this issue particularly?
I would say, please visit the California Budget and Policy Center's website, calbudgetcenter.org. We have some resources on there related to the Gann limit, and we're going to be adding stuff to our website. As I said earlier, the Legislative Analyst's Office has been doing really excellent work on the Gann limits. I would suggest the LAO's website as being the place to go to check out their most recent stuff on the Gann limit. Beyond reading, I would say feel free to reach out to us at the Budget Center. Any advocates in your audience, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Okay. Thank you.
Contact.
Thank you.
I'm happy to direct anybody to any of my smart colleagues on the team, because we are really trying to dig in, like a lot of folks in Sacramento, and figure out, what does this mean? The Gann limit, whether or not you think you can manage it well this year and maybe next year, it's a relic of a bygone era, and it's a roadblock to creating a better California. It will, over time, constrain our ability to invest in current services. The reality is there are quite a few services that are likely to grow in cost more than the limit is allowed to grow each year. You have services for seniors,
fundamental flaw in
disabilities,
right?
Healthcare. You end up with a situation where you could squeeze the side of the budget that doesn't relate to Proposition 98. There's a squeeze on current services that we're very likely to see if the Gann limit continues.
Wow, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. What if you want to make really huge investments? Like, we want to make a big investment in childcare. We want to go big on healthcare. We want to go big on ongoing assistance to help people afford their rent, to keep a roof over their heads. The Gann limit says no. The Gann limit constrains all of these types of ongoing people-focused investments that increase health and economic security. It's basically saying, no, that's excessive, unnecessary. We don't need to go down that road. We at the Budget Center think that is not the way to govern. It does not help us get to where we need to be.
Well, it's like Gann is still governing in 2022.
That's the idea. The goal was to impose the values of the late 1970s on all future generations of Californians. And we are seeing what that looks like today.
Right. Really quickly, what are some options then to fix Gann?
There's not necessarily a simple fix here, because the Gann limit is in the state constitution. So whether we're going to repeal it or make major reforms to it, we'll have to go to the voters, right? So the legislature could pass a constitutional amendment with a 2/3 vote and put it on a future ballot. Not going to happen this year, probably, but it's happening maybe a little bit down the road. Basically, we have to go back to the voters and make the case Gann limit is not working. You can repeal it, which would be the simplest way of doing it, or you can also make adjustments to the formula. So you can get a lot more room under the limit. And it's not a factor in the budgeting.
Scott, this has been illuminating, a little complex, but I think we stayed a big picture and made some important points for folks to think about as they prepare their campaigns or they're in their campaigns, and how they talk about what it is that they're trying to do. knowing that you need to factor this into what you're trying to do and the obstacles that you're up against. And as you said, the opportunities that you now have that you might not have realized. I thank you so very much. Any last words for us?
Well, I think you hit it there by reemphasizing the opportunities and the obstacles. I would just urge advocates not to get lulled into this idea that, oh, we can live with the Gann limit, everything will be fine. We can just manage within these narrow priorities that Gann allows. In fact, if we want to plan for and make the bold investments that are needed in California for everyone to be healthy and thrive and for everyone to share in the states, the Gann limit is going to have to be significantly reformed or repealed.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.